Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Welcome back to Spanish Lessons with Professor Jason. I'm glad you joined me for lesson 8 in my 13-part series on asking and answering questions in Spanish. In this lesson, lesson 8, I'm going to focus on how to ask and answer questions dealing with people's routine activities, the types of things we tend to do every day. But before we get to that, let me remind you about the other topics covered in this series. Okay, you can see from this slide where today's lesson fits into the overall sequence and what the other topics are. I recommend viewing the entire series in order, since I've designed it so that the vocabulary and grammar structures build on each other in terms of complexity. Alright, let's go to the whiteboard for our discussion of the questions and answers for today's lesson. Okay, let me start off by saying that there are several ways that you can ask someone or that you can be asked to talk about or describe your daily routine. For example, let's take a look at this first card here. You could simply ask or be asked, ¿Cómo es tu rutina diaria? O ¿Cuál es tu rutina diaria? Right? A variation of this might be to ask someone, ¿Qué haces todos los días? ¿Qué haces todos los días? So the first thing I want to do is run through all the questions because they're basically different ways to ask the same thing. Or, ¿Qué haces en un día típico? ¿Qué haces en un día típico? If I want to be a little bit more specific, ¿Qué haces los lunes? And again, los lunes, I'm asking on Mondays, so every Monday, perhaps. ¿Qué haces los lunes? Or on weekends. ¿Qué haces los fines de semana? The point is, so far with all of these variations, we're asking people to tell us what they usually do, right? ¿Cuál es tu rutina diaria? ¿O qué haces todos los días? Let's look at a couple more possibilities. Somebody might say, instead of asking a question, they might tell you to describe or to narrate your daily routine. Describe tu rutina diaria. So keep in mind, the function might be interrogative, but it might not sound like a question, right? Describe tu rutina diaria. Describe tu rutina diaria. Or, similarly, cuéntame, tell me, cuéntame lo que haces todos los días. Tell me what you do every day. Cuéntame lo que haces todos los días. O cuéntame lo que haces en un día típico. Let me run through those questions one more time. Okay? Again, all basically the same way to get someone to talk about their daily routine. So if we hear any of these forms, we're going to describe what we do usually. ¿Cómo o cuál es tu rutina diaria? ¿Cuál es tu rutina diaria? Or, ¿qué haces todos los días? ¿Qué haces todos los días? What do you do every day? Or, ¿qué haces en un día típico? ¿Qué haces los lunes? ¿Qué haces on weekends, los fines de semana? Or we can tell somebody, describe o descríbeme tu rutina diaria. Describe your daily routine. Or tell me what you do. Cuéntame lo que haces en un día típico o todos los días. All right. Now, there's at least four key things that I want to talk about in terms of what we should focus on or keep in mind as we answer these questions, right? ¿Qué haces todos los días? All right? The first one is that we answer by conjugating common verbs, right? Common verbs in the present tense. So if somebody asks me what I do every day, right, I'm saying things like, well, I wake up, I have breakfast, right, etc., etc. I'm conjugating common verbs in the present tense. Bear with me while I try to adjust the microphone here. All right, looks like that's not going to work so well. Second thing to keep in mind is that many of the verbs we use to describe our daily routine are reflexive. So lots of these verbs that we're going to conjugate in the present tense, lots of them are reflexive verbs. Okay, a couple things to keep in mind. I already have a different video lesson that covers reflexive verbs. Okay, and in fact, I have a separate video lesson on this topic, talking about your daily routine. So you can see the links that I'm going to put up on the screen right now for those two lessons. Third thing to keep in mind if somebody asks you, ¿Qué haces todos los días? is that there are several temporal words or transitional, right? Transitions. Here I go. That you can use to put things in order, right? To order or to put things in a sequence. Things like, first I do that, then I do this, later on we do this, and we'll go through these all in Spanish, right? I just want to point out 4 of the things I'm going to focus on. And then finally, after some transitions, right? So after some, particularly antes de, that form, and después de, we actually don't conjugate. And we'll see examples of all 4 of these principles. So remember, somebody asks me, what do you do every day? What's your daily routine, right? ¿Cuál es tu rutina diaria? Cuéntame lo que haces todos los días. I'm going to be using common everyday verbs in the present tense. A lot of these are reflexive in Spanish. I want to keep in mind some temporal transitional expressions so they can order them, right? First, next, finally, later on, etc. And then if I use these 2 expressions, antes de o después de, what comes after is an infinitive, right? An unconjugated form. So let's take a look first at some of the daily routine verbs, okay? All right, and again, I do have a separate lesson on this where I introduce a few more verbs. Just for the sake of brevity, I won't introduce a full spectrum of common, well, obviously it could be anything, of daily routine verbs, but let's take a look at a few, okay? I'll just write them down in Spanish and say them in English as I go. Despertarse. Despertarse. I put se on the end, that's indicating it's a reflexive verb. To wake up in the morning. Despertarse. Often followed by levantarse, to get up, to actually get up out of bed. Levantarse. Bañarse, to take a bath. Or ducharse, to take a shower. Bañarse, ducharse. To get dressed. Vestirse, vestirse. How about to have breakfast? Desayunar. And sometimes you'll see this used reflexively, but not necessarily, right? Depends a little bit on the dialect. Desayunar or desayunarse, to have breakfast. How about something a lot of us do every morning, which is to ver mis, I'll put it in the first person, mensajes, right? I want to check my messages. I might even say chequear or checar or ver mis mensajes, depending on my dialect. Check my messages. My email would be what's implied. Ver mis mensajes. I could also say another common verb would be ir al trabajo, right? To go to work. And again, we're conjugating this, so you're going to hear things like voy al trabajo, veo mis mensajes, desayuno, right? Me visto, but we'll get to examples of them conjugated in a minute. Ir al trabajo, or maybe I go to school. Ir a la escuela. Okay, ir a la escuela. I think I can fit one more on here. Around noon, almorzar. Almorzar. So again, we see lots of reflexive verbs, but then we see some that aren't necessarily reflexive. Okay? We have a mix then of reflexive and regular verbs. Let me erase some of these so I can put a few more daily routine verbs down. We just talked about almorzar, to have lunch. How about when I leave work? Salir del trabajo. Right? For example, salgo del trabajo a las 5. Or arrive home. Llegar a casa. Right? Have dinner. Cenar. How about watch TV? Ver televisión. And again, there's literally hundreds of verbs you could use. Ver televisión to describe your daily routine. It's personal. But I'm just giving some common, sort of common sense ones. leer o leer un poco. How about if I go online, navegar, right, en internet, right? Or I go to bed, acostarse, right? Acostarse. So again, these were some verbs in the infinitive, and we're seeing quite a few reflexive verbs, but many that aren't reflexive, okay? So again, these are going to be conjugated in the first person of the present tense, right? But many of them will be reflexive. All right, let's look at some of those temporal or transitional expressions that we can use to put things in order, right? Things like first, next, later, usually, sometimes, always, finally, right? So, in a second, we're going to put these all together. Primero, right? First. So maybe I say, primero me despierto, right? First, I wake up. Somebody asks me, what do you do every day? And I want to give them the TMI, too much information version. Primero me despierto. That's our first transitional or temporal word. How about después? In a narration like this, a description of activities or a sequence of activities, después means next. Primero me despierto, después me levanto. A variation on that you can say so you don't repeat yourself too much. Luego, or even más tarde, sort of that idea of later on. Later or later on. Okay, más tarde. You can use this as sort of a transitional expression, generalmente, to indicate usually or typically what I do. Like if I want to say a time, generalmente me despierto a las 7:30. Generalmente. You can also say normalmente, usualmente, por lo general. Okay. A veces, sometimes. A veces, sometimes. Siempre, if you always do something every day. Siempre me despierto temprano. I always wake up early. Okay? And then one more, if you want to say what you do at the very end of the day. Finalmente. Of course, these are useful for any type of narration, right? What did you do yesterday? Primero, luego, finalmente, right? But especially useful when describing your daily routine in the present tense, what you typically do, okay? So I'm going to use some of these in a brief example so you can see how they help to connect and put things into a sequence, right? So I might say something like, if somebody asks me, ¿Qué haces todos los días? This is a question that tends to come up in basic or intermediate level Spanish oral proficiency interviews because they want to see how well you can conjugate it in the present tense and whether you can use these transitional and temporal expressions to sort of link your ideas together. So I might say something like, primero, right, me despierto. Primero me despierto. Después, remember that one meant next. Después me levanto. And then you can add, right, with the conjunction and, y me baño. I wake up and I take a shower, I have a bath. So, primero me despierto, again, conjugating the first person of the present tense. Después me levanto y me baño, right? Again, there's a separate video lesson on reflexive verbs. And I can keep on going from there, right? I might say something like, luego, another transition, luego me lavo los dientes y me peino. Okay? Primero, luego me lavo los dientes y me peino. So next, I brush my teeth and I comb my hair. Me peino. Right? Using another one of those transitions we just talked about. generalmente, comma, desayuno, and then I can give a time. A las 8:30 de la mañana would be implied, right? Después, again, next or later, después, I go to work, conjugating the verb ir, right? Conjugating the verb ir. Voy al trabajo. Or I could say, voy a la escuela, right? Moving on, trabajo, por ejemplo, hasta mediodía. Right? So I work until noon, trabajo hasta mediodía. Then I can skip a little bit, but you get the idea. Cuando llego, again, conjugated in the first person. Cuando llego a casa, sort of another temporal transition phrase. When I do something. Cuando llego a casa, por la tarde, again, an expression of the time of day. Por la tarde. Cuando llego a casa por la tarde, sorry if that's getting a little bit hard to read. Again, another verb. Veo televisión. Veo televisión. Or a veces hablo con amigos. But you get the idea. So we're using a lot of those connectors or temporal transitional expressions, right? Expressions. Primero, después, luego, right? Generalmente, again, después, cuando, a veces. So that's how those work. That's how those allow us to link our ideas together. So we're seeing some of those principles I pointed out. We're seeing everyday verbs, to wake up, to brush your teeth, right? To work, to come home, to arrive home, to watch TV, to talk to friends. Conjugated in the first person, present, right? And connected with these transitional and temporal expressions, okay? Now let's take just a second and focus on something that's slightly more advanced, although it's not too tricky, and that's what I mentioned before, the fact that we can incorporate unconjugated verbs, verbs left in the infinitive, after the expressions antes de, which means before doing something, and después de, obviously after doing something. So whatever comes after either of these expressions is not conjugated. Por ejemplo, right? I could write something like después de bañarme. I didn't conjugate it, right? All I did was change that reflexive pronoun. Después de bañarme, me lavo los dientes. Now I do conjugate out here. Me lavo los dientes. So whatever comes immediately after this expression is not conjugated. Después de bañarme, me lavo, conjugated, los dientes. After bathing, after taking a shower, I brush my teeth. Okay? Give an example. Antes de. Antes de, antes de salir para el trabajo, before leaving for work, antes de salir, not conjugated after antes de. Antes de salir para el trabajo, now I conjugate the next clause, desayuno con mi esposa. Okay, so an example of después de, antes de, what comes immediately after it not being conjugated. Después de bañarme, me lavo los dientes. Antes de salir para el trabajo, desayuno, conjugated, con mi esposa. Now we're going to bring all this together in one extended and probably way too long answer, but that would really impress the pants off, or the skirt off, your evaluator, the person interviewing you. Again, so, assuming we get the question in our interview, or in just our conversation, someone wants to know, ¿Cuál o cómo es tu rutina diaria? Or they ask us in a different form, such as, they say, describe tu rutina diaria, o, por ejemplo, cuéntame lo que haces todos los días o en un día típico. Cuéntame lo que haces en un día típico. ¿Cuál es tu rutina diaria? All right. Primero, it's just a model answer, right? Primero, me despierto a las 7. Primero me despierto a las 7. Después me levanto, in conjugating in the yo form, right? Y, linking ideas, y me baño. Okay? Después me levanto y me baño. Now I'm going to use that después de, after doing something. Después de bañarme, you can see how I'm linking these ideas together, right? I already mentioned taking a bath up here. Después de bañarme, right? Me seco, I dry off, y me peino. So again, keeping in mind those 3 or 4 principles we talked about, right? We're seeing common verbs, right? To get up, to wake up, to get up, to have a bath, to dry off, to comb your hair. We're seeing them conjugated in the first person of the yo, all right? The first person of the present tense, rather. We're seeing them linked together with these expressions, temporal and transitional expressions, and we're seeing an infinitive or unconjugated form after después de. Notice the difference between these two. Después, comma, conjugate. Después de, after doing something, which is in the infinitive. So let's continue. Después de bañarme, me seco y me peino. Sometimes, using just a different transitional temporal expression, a veces me afeito. Afeitarse is to shave. A veces me afeito también, as well, or also. So sometimes I also shave. A veces me afeito también. I'm getting very detailed here, but the interviewer is going to love that, right? Luego, what did that one mean? Luego, next. Luego me visto. Just a really short sentence. Luego me visto. But I follow that up with, after getting dressed, right? Después de vestirme, what do? I can do several things, right? Desayuno, y veo mis mensajes. I check my email, I check my messages, right? And then we could just keep on going, right? Después voy a la universidad. Antes de mi primera clase, what do? Again, present tense verbs in the yo form. Estudio, it's not reflexive. Estudio un poco en la biblioteca. I mean, if you think about it, we're not using super advanced vocabulary. We're using common verbs, common nouns, right? And just stringing them together in a way that sounds sophisticated because of all these transitional and temporal connectors or expressions that we're throwing in there, right? So, I could say something like, I return home, vuelvo a casa. And again, another strategy you can do is to add the time, right? So, vuelvo a casa a las 11:30 y vuelvo a casa a las 11:30 y almuerzo. So that gets us halfway through the day. Vuelvo a casa a las 11:30 y almuerzo. Anyway, you get the idea. So remember, if somebody asks us, ¿qué haces todos los días? We're going to conjugate in the first person yo form. A lot of these verbs are reflexive, right? Me visto, me lavo los dientes, me afeito, me seco, but not all of them, right? Voy, desayuno, veo, estudio, vuelvo, almuerzo. So we have a mix of reflexive and not reflexive, right? See separate lesson on reflexives. We're going to use, when appropriate, these types of temporal connectors or transitions to link or sew our ideas together. Okay? And then finally, there was a fourth thing, but I can't remember it right now. Let's see. What was the fourth thing? Finally, after después de or antes de, we don't conjugate. Okay? All right, that concludes Lesson 8 in my series on asking and answering basic questions in Spanish. I hope you found it to be informative and useful. As always, I welcome your questions, comments, and suggestions. So if you've got a moment, please leave a comment. Let me know what you thought about this particular video lesson. I like to hear your input and feedback. Remember, you can find lots more Professor Jason content right here or over at my website, professorjason.com. For more updates, you can follow me on Twitter or like my Facebook community, and I'll put that information up on the screen in just a minute. Again, thanks for watching. This has been Professor Jason, your guide to Spanish, and I'll see you at the next lesson. Hasta pronto. Ciao.